medicinal products to leather goods, from pet food to cosmetics. But most profitable of all, they get turned into food for humans. This is the face of agribusiness today. Large, industrialized, highly efficient, and totally cost-conscious. It's the reason we have some of the cheapest food in the world. But there is a cost. It is the cost to the animal itself. For we have taken this benign, naturally flatulent vegetarian and turned it first into a cannibal. And when that didn't work, into a vampire. We've made its brain and spinal cord into toxic sites. We've managed to turn its feces into something that routinely makes us sick and occasionally kills us. We've taken on the cow and used it as our experiment in developing the perfect food machine. In the process, we've created our very own Frankensteer. "50 years ago, eating a roast beef dinner was reserved for special occasions.
This meat looks good to me.
Yes, it's the best I've bought for a long time.
50 years ago, beef was a lot more variable, a lot tougher, and a lot more expensive.
Good meat, all right.
50 years ago, we produced beef for the table in a very different fashion. But not that much different from what Bob Kerr's doing today on his farm in Chatham, Ontario.
Conditions are very like what they would encounter in nature, but maybe even better than nature, because the animals are living in their natural environment here. They eat their natural diet, and they feed themselves and spread their own manure. And look at the diversity of species. I can see 3 or 4 different species of grasses. I guess you might say this is heifer heaven. When I'm on the pasture, I can feel their pleasure. It's their natural environment. It's their natural diet. You know, this is the life that they were meant for. The alternative would be to live in a feedlot and be fed on a diet which is not in their biological heritage.
For the first 6 to 8 months, the biological heritage for all calves, except for the benighted veal calves, is to spend their days outside, contently chewing on the grass and suckling their mother's milk. And then, for the vast majority of beef calves, their world suddenly changes.
What we're doing here is we're taking cattle off grass. That's their natural environment, so to speak, and we're bringing them into a stressful situation. A lot of times they're pulled off their mothers, and they're taken through stockyards and weaned, and then brought to a place like this where they're processed. They just start breaking down, and they just they get under a little bit of stress, or a lot of stress, you know.
Rick Pascal runs 3 feedlots in an area of southern Alberta known as Feedlot Alley. It's here that more cattle are concentrated than anywhere else in Canada. Some 40,000 head of cattle out of the roughly 1 million in Feedlot Alley get processed each year through Rick Pascal's feedlots. They spend their days sleeping, meandering around the mounds of their dung, and most importantly, eating. For they are here for only one reason: to be fattened for slaughter, and to do it as quickly and as cheaply as possible.
Grass is the natural source for them, but it's not harmful to the animal, feeding them grains. That's just the way that our industry has evolved. You know, beef that is grain finished, so they have a high degree of marbling. That's what our consumer demands.
They will be ready for slaughter a year earlier than cattle left to graze on grass. And one of the reasons is that they are being fed grain. It makes them grow fatter quicker. The life of a cow took a revolutionary turn in the 1950s with the expansion of small finishing feedlots into large-scale feeding operations. One reason for the expansion was that grain, like barley and corn, had become cheap to produce, cheap enough to use as feed for cattle.
So normally cattle never evolved to consume high grain diets. They never would ever consume that level out in a normal grazing situation. You know, they'd consume a few seed heads and that from the grass, but never at the concentration that they encounter in a feedlot.
It takes some time to get cattle to eat grains, especially because at first it makes them sick and has to be done gradually. Too much, too quickly can lead to disaster.
The worst nightmare in a feedlot probably would be feeding cattle a wrong ration. You know, like if we have some inexperienced help here, instead of feeding a number 1 ration that is mostly silage, feeding them a full feed ration to cattle that are not ready to take that feed on, and of course that's going to really upset the apple cart, and it'll result in the death of a lot of these cattle.
There's a couple of things that can potentially kill the cattle when they're fed that grain diet. One is a condition which we call lactic acidosis. In that situation, the contractions in the digestive tract stops.
In the winter of 2005, Alberta was the site of a horrific example of how feed can kill.
These cattle had severe acidosis. Basically what acidosis does is it gives them a bellyache, so they start drinking a lot of water, and the starches in the grain work so fast in their rumen that it puts a toxic poison through them. And when that happens, they just turn to mush and liquid, and they were freezing to death because it was also 25, 30 below that night.
While it was shocking to find almost 200 cattle dead because of wrong feed, it is perhaps more shocking to discover just how dependent feedlots across North America have become on antibiotics.
A relatively small percentage of the diet consists of these pellets. And these pellets are where we would administer the subtherapeutic antibiotic, typically in a commercial situation.
These pellets contain antibiotics, but they are not there to treat sick cattle. Subtherapeutic antibiotics are by and large used to prevent disease from spreading through tightly confined animals, just as they're used in the industrial pork and poultry operations of North America.
In terms of what a subtherapeutic dosage is that you're including the antibiotic in the diet, and it's usually administered in the diet. You're treating all the animals in the herd, not just those that may become sick, even animals that are not exhibiting signs of disease.
While subtherapeutic usage of antibiotics is a common practice in feedlots, the stress of so many cattle packed together can still lead to sickness. And that means even more antibiotics.
The biggest issue that you have in feedlot cattle is respiratory issues. This is an animal they pulled because he's sick, eh? And he's got a high temperature. They give him a rectal thermometer and to find out what their temperature. An average temperature is 101.5, kind of 102, and they treat accordingly, you know. So you can see he's a little bit warm, and he's just fighting off the infection, basically. This is a business about economics, and once we got a figure here, we put $50 into the animal, and then we stop treating, you know. So it's and they either got to make it or they don't make it. So you got to call quits here at some point in time.
Oh, in terms of the amount of antibiotics that are used in livestock production, it may account for as much as 50% of the total tonnage of antibiotics that are used in Canada.
One of the biggest concerns about using such vast quantities of antibiotics on livestock is the potential threat this might have on humans.
We know that feeding antibiotics results in antibiotic resistance. That's a given. The bacteria will develop a method to evolve so that they're resistant to those antibiotics. So the way to approach that is to look at which of those antibiotics are very important in human medicine so that we don't compromise the potential or value of those antibiotics for treating human infections.
While the Europeans have chosen to ban the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics for all farm animals, Canadian and American regulators have opted to continue this practice. It's a practice that's also had a surprising side effect on cattle. Feeding cattle with subtherapeutic antibiotics had an unexpected effect. It made them grow faster. And so these antibiotics joined the pharmaceutical industry's other product that tricked Mother Nature, growth-promoting hormones.
They've been around for 40 years or so, and basically what they do is introduce minuscule amounts of extra hormones into beef. What that does is it enables us to produce those animals at several months younger age, and they consume less feed, significantly less feed, about 15% less feed in the process of gaining weight in the feed yards.
The cattle are pumped up like bodybuilders on steroids. Hormones improve the ability for cattle to make more of that valuable muscle and less of that unprofitable fat. Hormones are all about the bottom line. And one of the more popular of the growth hormones is Revel-RH.
Revel-RH is a combination of two hormones that are produced as implants for implantation under the skin at the back of the ear in feedlot cattle. And the claim is that this is to increase their rate of gain and feed efficiency in the feedlot.
But before Revel-RH could be approved for use in Canada, as it already was in the United States, Health Canada scientists were obliged to look over a variety of studies conducted on this new drug combination. What they discovered worried them.
In the 3 studies that I reviewed that came out of Europe, there is a very, very obvious and significant dose-related decrease in the thymus weight. Now, the significance of the thymus gland is that that's very important for the maturation of the immune system in these young animals, and this applies, of course, to humans as well.
But senior management at Health Canada did not share their concerns, and that's one reason why the scientists ended up testifying in front of a Canadian Senate hearing.
I took this matter to Dr. Landry, who was acting director. I said, this is what we are observing. There are serious problems. The uterus of these heifers is enlarged. The thymus gland is regressed. Now, thymus gland is the organ that controls your entire immunological system. That tells you something. And when I took this matter to Dr. Landry, he said, so what? They're going to be slaughtered. I said, for God's sake, they're going to be eaten by people.
Despite the objections by its own scientists, Health Canada went ahead and joined the Americans in approving Revel-RH.
So in this case, each of those concerns that were raised by the scientists were investigated by other scientists, reviewed, and we came to the conclusion that the available evidence that we have that the use of this product will not pose an undue risk to human health, and that's why the product was approved.
The Europeans had taken a different approach to antibiotics and hormones in their animals. Unlike North America, they followed what is known as a precautionary model in the use of these drugs.
They banned the use of all these growth-promoting hormones back in about 1988, and they do not allow the importation of Canadian beef into the European Union because of our use of hormones.
The Europeans had already seen just what kind of damage one growth hormone had done back in the 1970s.
Dawes Laboratories produces DES, a chemical used to increase weight gain in livestock, and a chemical that a growing number of workers have come to fear.
Some 50 years ago, diethylstilbestrol, better known as DES, was one of the first hormones to be used to fatten cattle. By the early 1970s, studies showed that residues of DES in meat could cause cancer in humans. But it would take almost 7 years of legal battles with the beef and pharmaceutical industries before DES was finally taken off the market. By that time, though, there was a new hormone available bearing a strong resemblance to DES. It's named estradiol. And estradiol is one of the 2 compounds that make up Revel-RH.
One of the 6 of the hormones that the European Union has banned based on the science that this stuff is toxic, it causes cancer, is Revel-RH. And it has estradiol in it. And estradiol is a complete carcinogen. It initiates cancerous tumors and it grows those tumors. And the population that's most at risk are young girls and pregnant women, and it also is known to cause breast cancer.
Further European research published in 2002 reaffirmed the European Union's contention that estradiol was a true carcinogen. The American Food and Drug Administration and Health Canada decided to review those European research papers.
We came to the conclusion, given all the evidence that we reviewed, that the use of that product will not pose a risk.
The argument centers on how much of the hormone remains in the meat. Does it exceed the maximum residual limit set by the American and Canadian regulators?
If something causes cancer, you cannot, no scientist can, put a maximum residue limit, because even a single molecule of a drug or residue can attach to a single cell, and when it's done on a repeated daily basis in your food, then it can generate, it can stimulate and promote cancer. That's what the Europeans, how they made their decision. We cannot give you a safe limit.
The Europeans banned Canadian and American beef. They in turn were taken to court by the Americans and Canadians. We had now managed to turn the cow into a weapon in a vicious battle over trade.
It went to court, and the European Union asked the WTO for Canada's risk assessment on estradiol, on Revelar H. And the response from the government of Canada is, sorry, our risk assessment and how we determine safe levels of estradiol is secret.
Can we see that report?
The EU 17 studies?
Your Health Canada review of this report. Can we see it? Is it public? Is it open to the public?
It's not. It's an internal review. It's just something that we review. We work closely with the US on this. You know, because we are concerned. We also want to, when any public health issues are raised, we want to make sure we investigate that. If there is any evidence to indicate that something could pose a risk to public health, we take it very seriously. So we did our internal review, and that's the conclusion we came to.
In June of 2005, the Health Canada scientists are back on Parliament Hill, still voicing their concerns, but this time they're not speaking as employees of Health Canada, but rather as private citizens, fired by Health Canada for insubordination. Whistleblowers are not necessarily appreciated, even by members of the opposition party.
If there's certain problems within the bureaucracy, within the science, then let's have it.
We've told you that
there's a lot of hearsay.
We've told you that hormones have been demonstrated in science to cause cancer. I'm asking you as parliamentarians to let this information come out to you so that you can make your proper decisions.
As cattle continue to get their hormones and antibiotics, the scientists continue to argue over the science. If the officials are right, then we and the cattle have nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, there have been a number of times that they've been wrong. And in one case so wrong that it almost destroyed the Canadian beef industry. Sometime in the 1950s, slaughterhouses and renders discovered that they could turn a seemingly worthless part of their operation into feed for beef, and especially dairy cattle.
You could really increase beef production and milk production by dramatically increasing the protein content of the feed, and the easiest way of doing that was to grind up animals.
It was just one more step in our ongoing experiment to turn the cow into the perfect food machine. And in the process, we transformed these herbivores into cannibals as we started feeding them the meat and bones of their fellow cattle.
It was not only cows that were ground up, it was roadkill, it was sheep, it was, you know, dead pets. So everything went into the mix, and it came out badly in the United Kingdom.
In the mid-1980s, British cows began to exhibit bizarre behavior. Something strange was eating away at their brains.
They were called spongiform encephalopathies because the appearance of the brain was literally full of holes like a sponge instead of full of cells.
Scientists discovered that a rogue protein was to blame. It was given the name prion.
Very early on, we recognized that they were transmitted through meat and bone meal. Most often it was simply processed by heat to destroy the standard pathogens like bacteria and viruses. But prions survived those procedures, and the meat and bone meal was contaminated with prions and infected more and more cows.
What was particularly worrisome about prions was that even after the cows die, the prions survive. And standard methods of sterilization proved totally ineffective.
The Europeans looked at this and said, this material is indestructible, these prions, except an unusual circumstance. You put them in a cement kiln at 1100 degrees, you can kill them. Autoclave won't kill them. Chemicals won't kill them. So we have to be precautionary.
And there was reason to be concerned, because unlike similar transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, which stayed pretty well within a single species, as Scrapie does with sheep, the prions in this mad cow disease exhibited a frightening new attribute.
And the interesting thing about the mad cow disease epidemic in the UK is that it showed that these prions can actually jump species. That obviously has public health implications.
Suddenly, across England, young people started coming down with a variation of a spongiform encephalopathy that led to a painful-to-watch death. It was called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, VCJD. It took 2 excruciating years before Peter Hall succumbed to variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Just 9 days before his 21st birthday.
The variant CJD is the form that's most likely caused by exposure to meat products that were contaminated with high risk, like brain and spinal cord, from infected cows with BSE.
The British and Europeans, seeing more than 150 of their citizens die from VCJD, put a stop to the practice of feeding any animal remains to any and all farm animals.
Back in 96 and 97, when the global debate was going on about abandoning cannibalizing of animals because that was deemed to be the method of propagation of the disease, in North America, the American beef packing industry said, hold on, we make far too much money rendering inedible offal. We are not going to stop.
North American beef packers and renderers lobbied their governments not to follow the Europeans in their total ban of feeding animals to other animals.
So they bent. They said, okay, we'll just stop feeding cows to cows. We can still render down beef product and feed it to pigs and feed it to chickens, but no more feeding beef to beef.
My opinion is that it would be best to remove this high-risk material from the all-animal feed system, because there could be 2 ways it can get back to cattle. One is by mistake on the farm, that if you buy a bag of pig feed and that might be fed to the cattle by mistake, then there's cross-contamination. So if this is made in mills for pigs and poultry, is our system of flushing out those high-risk materials adequate? It would be hard to say that it was adequate to totally remove, if there was infectivity in the system, out of the mills.
A newly created bureau, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, took the lead in enforcing the ban.
In 1997, when we introduced the feed ban in place in Canada, that particular feed ban did go beyond the World Health Organization recommendations. It did include other mammalian material, poultry litter, restaurant waste, other things that other countries did not do.
No more feeding cattle to cattle, with one glaring exception. The blood from slaughtered cows could still be used as a type of milk replacer to feed to calves.
7 years ago, Health Canada looked at this and said, this is a bad idea. And they are the experts on health risk, not CFIA. And so told their fellow federal department, you should stop this.
Despite objections by a few Health Canada scientists, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency chose to listen to other experts.
What we have done in Canada is to align our programming with the best peer-reviewed international science. The recognized international body for that is the World Organization for Animal Health. Under OIE standards, certain products are deemed to be not a risk for BSE and can be fed safely to animals, including blood.
There is no definitive studies that have shown at this point in time that blood orally fed to other animals will transmit BSE.
While there might not be any definitive studies connecting BSE and cattle blood, there was very little information about just how many of the millions of Canadian cattle slaughtered each year might actually harbor the dreaded disease.
Historically, Canada has never done much testing. And in the 1990s, we were on average testing 1,000 cattle a year for BSE. So we had a minimal testing program for the decade that our herds were most exposed to possible BSE contamination.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has, in the last few years, increased the number of tests for BSE, particularly among older cattle. Even with that increase, it still means that less than 2% of the total number of cattle slaughtered annually get tested.
When you start testing more, you find more. Rough guess, you'd have to test maybe half to give yourself a reasonable statistical chance of finding it. So we don't want to know. We just do not want to know.
What we have attempted to do through the entire BSE crisis is to inform the public about what we're doing, why we're doing it, where's the science behind what we're doing, exposing ourselves to international peer review, inviting other countries to come in and assess what we're doing, and to be able to work with them to meet their issues. As I said, every country that has come through has repeatedly said to us, we believe you're doing the right thing. We have confidence in the safety of your food. We want not only your food, we want your inspection system and how you're doing it.
I don't think of any European nation would look upon Canada's system and say, geez, that's what we need. They would look upon it as a kind of lackadaisical U.S.-influenced model that's designed to promote trade but not necessarily produce safe food.
The argument by both the United States Drug Administration and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is that testing for BSE is not the best way to assure food safety.
Your best protection is not by the test for public health. The best protection is to remove the high-risk material. So the brain, the spinal cord, the intestines from the human food chain. And real key is in the slaughter plant to prevent the cross-contamination. So when you're removing these tissues, not to contaminate the rest of the carcass that would go for consumption.
But what this really means is that these specified risk materials are treated as toxic elements within the cow. First we gave this poor animal mad cow disease. Now we've labeled parts of it hazardous waste sites. On May 20th, 2003, North American news broadcast led with a devastating story from Canada.
Good evening. It is the last thing Canada's beef industry needs. A confirmed case of so-called mad cow disease has turned up in a single cow in Alberta.
Almost immediately, the American border was closed to Canadian cattle. But within less than 4 months, Canadian beef was once again crossing that border. Not live on the hoof, but in boxes full of vacuum-packed loins and chucks, some of the most profitable of the beef cuts.
All of our industry leadership and all of our politicians at every level of government wanted us to believe that the good lobbying of industry and politics got that border open. That was so much bullshit. That border opened because the United States needed beef, period. They don't grow enough beef in the United States to feed their own country. They need to import beef.
But not just any beef. Because authorities believe that cattle under 30 months are unlikely to test positive for BSE, Americans were prepared to accept young Canadian beef. Anything over 30 months was Canada's problem. Most of these older cattle are known as cull cattle, animals that are no longer productive, unable to produce milk or calves. Rick Bonnet and his brothers were operating several feedlots in central Alberta that held thousands of cull cattle.
BSE come in on May 20th, 2003. It was a devastating blow, especially for us in the cull industry. You're sitting on a product that all of a sudden you can't sell it to anybody, you couldn't give it away.
And to feed those unwanted cattle, they were running up a tab of $50,000 a day.
The smartest thing we probably could have done on May 21st in hindsight now was to dig a hole and shoot them and bury them. It would have saved us about $15 million.
After over 30 years in business, Rick Bonnet and his brothers were driven out of their feedlot operations and forced into bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the two biggest packers in all of Canada were expanding their facilities. Lakeside Packers, owned and operated by the American Tyson Corporation, and another huge operation in High River, owned by the world's largest privately held food conglomerate, Cargill, transformed their operations to accommodate American demands that they slaughter only young cattle. There are estimates that these two packers slaughter anywhere from 65 to 80% of all the cattle in Canada. They run their slaughter operations like any efficient assembly line. The quicker the line speed, the bigger the profit.
The process is called a disassembly line. The employees disassemble the cow, and each worker stands in one place, performing a minute and specific function over and over and over. The line speed is horrific. Employees must work very, very fast. In fact, I know workers that cut the head off of a cow all day long with their right hand, pass it into their left hand, and hang it on a meat hook with their left hand. A cow's head weighing 50 or 60 pounds. It's difficult work. And one worker might do that 800-900 times a day.
CFIA inspectors and veterinarians are supposed to be monitoring these ever-quickening disassembly lines.
The problem we're having nowadays is that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is being creative in terms of meeting the demand of those high line speeds by being creative with formulas. What they're doing is creating a formula where we can minimize the amount of inspection regulators.
Following along with the recent American changes in food safety regulations, CFIA is now handing over more and more responsibility for inspection to the companies themselves.
I remember 25 years ago, when I came to the big Canada Packers in Toronto, we actually had an inspector who would be on the finals, the last point where the carcass was to be showered. And that inspector's responsibility was to assure that every visible fecal matter could be trimmed off. Could be, should be, or would be trimmed off. It was their responsibility, and we gave up that task. The agency told us that we were not quality control people for the plant. The plant had to quality control itself. And so they gave that responsibility to a company employee.
Perhaps the greatest food safety issue for beef packers today is the production of huge batches of ground beef.
When we look at the large-scale production systems that we employ now, where several thousand animals are slaughtered and that material goes into hamburger, if we have one contaminated animal go into that batch, we now have thousands of pounds of hamburger that are potentially contaminated, which then is distributed across a huge geographical area to a number of potential people who could become infected.
Batches of ground beef contaminated with something called E. coli 0157H7, bacteria that show up in the feces of cattle, have been known to kill, especially infants and seniors. E. coli 0157 is a bacterium that lives harmoniously within cattle, but for humans it can be deadly. And it suddenly and quite mysteriously started showing up in the ground beef coming out of North American slaughterhouses in the early 1980s.
And the question you have to ask is, well, where's all this E. coli coming from? Why are we having E. coli now? 30 years ago, we didn't have E. coli. E. coli, in a sense, is a man-made disease which is rooted in industrial slaughterhouses with fast speed of production where they don't clean the carcasses. So they're passing on the E. coli right on the product, wrapping it and putting it in the supermarket, and you're bringing it into your kitchen, and it's toxic.
Make sure that before you handle any foods, you wash your hands with warm, soapy water.
So when you bring a package of hamburger home from a supermarket, you have to treat it as toxic material. You have to make sure that you don't cross-contaminate with any other kitchen utensils, and certainly don't let your children touch the packaging. And you have to ask yourself, well, what benefit is there for the consumer to be exposed to these toxic hazards?
Ground beef contaminated with E. coli 0157 looks and smells as if there was nothing wrong with it. And so there was no warning that a toxin might lurk in the hamburger patties that Carole Major of Saint Scholastique, Quebec was preparing.
I was making hamburgers, and there was some blood on the counter. Marc-Antoine had come up beside me. He touched the drops of blood, and then I saw him put his hands in his mouth. That's how he got sick, not by eating meat. It was Sunday when he touched the contaminated blood, and by Thursday, he started to get diarrhea. And in the afternoon, we realized that he had blood clots in his stools. The blood clots were as big as oranges, and that's when we saw that there was nothing but blood in the toilet. We immediately left for the hospital.
8-year-old Marc-Antoine Major was soon moved to the intensive care unit, diagnosed with a life-threatening condition known as hemolytic uremic syndrome.
I knew we were in for a big fight to save him, because this is a very serious illness, and his kidneys had failed, and we know that many other organs can fail consecutive to this. So we had to dialyze him. He had other complications. His heart was involved. He had water on his lungs, and he developed jaundice, and he became confused. He became very confused. I was very worried because I knew this was of a very bad omen.
Marc-Antoine thought he was going to die. He took off his oxygen mask, asked us, his father and mother, to hold him, and he said goodbye to us. He was convinced he was going to die.
But Marc-Antoine managed to survive, where so many others didn't.
It's a very wicked disease with late complications. You have to follow these people for at least 10 years before we can say, you'll be okay. And even then.
It's very surprising. A drop of blood changed my life.
The slaughter industry sees irradiation of ground beef as one solution to treating the threat of E. coli 0157. Irradiation uses high-energy gamma rays, or electron beams or X-rays, to destroy bacteria from cattle feces that can contaminate a whole batch of ground beef. But there are some recent scientific studies that raise concerns about the effects of irradiation on the meat itself.
The principal type of reaction that I see that's detrimental is cross-bonding between molecules. We're getting material that's chemically altered by way of the irradiation that is inducing chemical transformations, as well as reducing vitamin efficacy or content, nutritive quality, and so on. That's a very complex thing, and to sort this out is difficult. Obviously, the industry is not willing to put money in investigating that kind of thing, and they're not going to spend a nickel more than what they have to on anything else unless the regulatory people ask them to review this and push them for that and so on.
Currently, the U.S. permits irradiation of its meat. Canada does not. However, some Canadian officials have joined with the meat packers of this country in promoting its immediate adoption here.
I certainly believe irradiation is a legitimate intervention step. It would be a very good risk mitigation step to be applied. In Minnesota, they advocate in their school box lunch programs. They encourage people to buy irradiated beef.
The only reason I could see from my perspective as a veterinarian, from my experience to irradiate food, is to just cover up the mistakes the industry is making. If you did the job right, we wouldn't have to go through this. Or if you want, then change the ingredient statement, irradiated feces put on it, so let the consumer know what's actually on the product. So in other words, you are what you eat.
people should be aware of where their food comes from. You know, years and years ago, we raised our beef, and it was strictly on grass, and the grass that we raised, without any additives of any kind. In fact, we didn't even have antibiotics.
Janet Main is a fifth-generation Albertan. She and her family have joined forces with 7 neighboring ranchers working the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies. They've created a company called Diamond Willow Range. They produce certified organic beef.
Everything that they eat is naturally produced. No spray, no fertilizer. It's sort of a principle you live by in some ways, that you want your animals to be free and live their natural life. It's comforting to think that you're producing animals that are themselves in as natural an environment as they can be. This is viable as an alternative, especially if the interest in organic food is out there.
There are a small number of cattle certified as organic in Canada. They're raised without antibiotics or growth hormones or any animal byproducts or chemical pesticides. But is that a viable option for the millions of cattle that are produced annually in the highly industrialized feedlots of this country?
Could we eliminate antibiotics and hormones tomorrow and maintain production and produce cattle? Undoubtedly, the answer to that is yes, we could. The producers will produce what the consumer demands. And if the consumer demands beef fed no antibiotics and they're prepared to pay the differential costs that may exist between those two systems, the producers will do it.
Even one of the biggest operators in Alberta's Feedlot Alley agrees.
Could we accommodate markets that would be hormone-free, antibiotic-free, BSE tested-free? Absolutely we can. What would that cost? You know, $20, $25 a steer or something? Maybe it might not even cost that much. You know, the cost, there would be a cost of significance, but for the betterment of our industry, I think the costs could be well reflected in prices that we could get out of the marketplace.
So at what cost do we go back? At what cost do we undo what we've created? At what cost do we turn Frankensteer, that antibiotic-dependent, hormone-laced carrier of toxic bacteria, back to that flatulent, benign herbivore that it once was?
If you would like to know about all the documentaries airing each week on the CBC and CBC News World, sign yourself up online at cbc.ca/docs.
Are purported benefits of fish oil supplementation for the prevention and treatment of heart disease just a fishtail? Thanks to recommendations like this from the American Heart Association, that individuals at high risk for heart disease ask their physicians about fish oil supplementation, it's grown into a multi-billion-dollar industry. We now consume over 100,000 tons of fish oil every year. But what does the latest science say? A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at all the best randomized clinical trials evaluating the effects of omega-3s on lifespan, cardiac death, sudden death, heart attack, and stroke, either advice to eat more oily fish or to take fish oil capsules. What did they find? Overall, they found no protective benefit for overall mortality, heart disease mortality, sudden cardiac death, heart attack, or stroke. What about for those who've already had a heart attack, though, and are trying to prevent another one? Still no benefit. Where did we even get this idea that omega-3s were good for the heart? Well, if you look at some of the older studies, the results looked promising. For example, the famous DART trial back in the 80s involving 2,000 men. Those advised to eat fatty fish had a 29% reduction in mortality. Pretty impressive. No wonder it got a lot of attention. But people seem to have forgotten about the sequel, the DART-2 trial. Same group of researchers, an even bigger study, 3,000 men, and those advised to eat oily fish, and particularly those supplied with fish oil capsules, had a higher risk of cardiac death. Put all the studies together, and there's no justification for the use of omega-3s as a structured intervention in everyday clinical practice, or for guidelines supporting more dietary omega-3s. So what should doctors say when their patients follow the American Heart Association advice to ask them about fish oil supplements? Well, given the new meta-analysis and other negative meta-analyses, our job as doctors should be to stop highly marketed fish oil supplementation in all of our patients. All fish contain small amounts of methylmercury, the most toxic form of mercury, and fish consumption represents the main source. We've seen that mercury exposure through fish consumption, even within the governmental safety limits, can have adverse neurological and behavioral effects on child development. And severe exposure can cause overt structural brain abnormalities like microcephaly, which is a shrunken brain disorder. But we didn't know whether low exposure could also affect brain size until this new study. Autopsy studies suggest mercury preferentially affects the developing cerebellum, and so researchers used ultrasound to measure the brain size in newborns of mothers who had high body levels of mercury, compared to a control group of women who had low levels of mercury. Let's put that into practical terms. Compared to the low-level control group, here's where the high-level mercury women were. Now, how much canned tuna consumption is that equivalent to? Here's what your body mercury burden is if you eat 1 serving of canned tuna a day, about half a can. Here's what 2 cans a week will do to you, and this is just 1 can a week. So the bodies of the women suffering high mercury contamination in the ultrasound brain study were considered heavily contaminated, but even just a little canned tuna once in a while could bump your levels even higher. So the high really wasn't that high, but still, what did they find? They demonstrated that newborns born to mothers with higher mercury hair levels had cerebellums up to 14% shorter than those born to mothers with lower mercury hair levels. They conclude that prenatal exposure to what may be considered really low levels of methylmercury does indeed influence fetal brain development, as detected by decreased size of a newborn's brain. the most common cause of adult-onset epilepsy in the world is called neurocysticercosis, which literally means pork tapeworms curled up inside our brain. A review last year out of the Mayo Clinic describes the problem. Cysticerci, meaning the pork tapeworm larvae, create cavities in the human brain and other body tissue where their tiny bodies grow, sometimes into tapeworms 2 to 7 meters in length, and can live up to 25 years in the human body. 7 meters means 23 feet long. On MRI, so-called wormholes appear. On CT scan, there can be so many in the brain at one time, it can appear similar to a starry sky. Each star is a fluid-filled cyst with the beginning of a living, growing tapeworm inside. This is what they look like on autopsy. This is what their face looks like. They have these rings of hooks to grab onto our brain tissue. Earlier this year, a review was published by the CDC on the public health implications of cysticercosis acquired in the United States. Pork tapeworms on the brain has emerged as a cause of severe neurologic disease in the United States. Even after pork tapeworm larvae infect our brain, some people remain asymptomatic their entire lives, while others can go for years without symptoms, and then suddenly become very ill with seizures, headaches, and other focal neurological deficits as the larvae multiply within the nervous system and other tissues, and can cause sudden death, just due to the pressure buildup in the brain.
Tonight on Hard Copy.
The truth behind the headlines from across the country and around the world. They claim milk does a body good, but find out why some brands may be doing more harm than good.
Up next, got milk? You may wish you didn't after tonight's Hard Target investigation exposes what's really in some of it.
Milk is loaded with powerful growth hormones, hormones that should never be in the human body.
Imagine a cow on crack cocaine. That's how author Robert Cohen describes something shot into millions of cows on American farms.
We genetically engineer a hormone that produces more milk when we didn't need more milk.
While Cohen admits calcium is good for you, he says leafy green vegetables have lots more calcium than milk.
If you look at nature's perfect food, human breast milk, there are 33 milligrams of calcium per 100-gram portion. Potato chips have 40, beans have 50, chickpeas 150, amaranth, a grain, has 267.
Cohen says dairy products are a poor source of calcium for another reason.
Every scientist in the world knows that protein inhibits calcium absorption, and milk is liquid meat. It's protein.
What is in milk that you say is poisonous, and why would the government be covering this up?
Well, what's in milk? You're drinking body fluids from other animals. 60% of the cows in America have leukemia virus. 80% have something called paratuberculosis. You don't want to eat something with that name, paratuberculosis. You've got irritable bowel syndrome in America. That's what it causes. 4 million American women have irritable bowel syndrome. You're talking about if your doctor said, I want you to eat today 53 slices of bacon because that cholesterol is good for you, you're eating from your dairy products the same cholesterol contained in 19,000 slices of bacon.